A Year with God, Day 98. The reading for today is out of 1 Kings chapter 6. It's when Solomon builds the temple. And it describes the temple that he builds and how it's overlaid within and without in gold. And it describes all the opulence and the majesty of the temple. The reading, the devotional reading, kind of talks a little bit about how sometimes this seems very, very over the top to us. But it talks some about the great cathedrals that people in the Middle Ages built, places of a lot of beauty. In the middle of the Dark Ages, that's something that would have really, really stood out in contrast to a lot of what people were used to. And I think part of the reason they did that, both the cathedrals and here in 1 Kings, I think sometimes, as they suggest in the reading, that our surroundings can change our perspectives. They can cause us to look at things a little bit differently. Case in point, I was in a Lutheran church not too long ago, and Lutheran churches are much, at least this particular one, I haven't been in a lot of them, are much more visually designed. There's a visual focus in the church, and so the church was built with a certain type of architecture. There were a lot of stained glass windows. There were a lot of images. There were a lot of symbols. And the idea there is that as you walked into that environment, you would see the symbols and it would get you thinking about what the symbols meant. And you would see the stained glass and you would think about what those stained glass pictures were supposed to represent. And the thought was that the visual elements would begin to turn your attention to God. And I think that's kind of what they're doing here too in 1 Kings, in the building of the temple. The hope is that as people approach this centerpiece of Israel, their attention would be turned towards the God of Israel who had so richly blessed them. The reading, or the devotional, challenges you as you approach your time of daily worship to think about environments and places in which impact your worship of God. And for me, I sometimes think of places outdoors, or I think sometimes of a room that we have set up in our house for prayer and for meditation. And those things sometimes turn my attention towards God. Sometimes I can come in to the room that we have set aside for prayer, and I'll sit down and I'll take a deep breath, and my thoughts will turn back towards God, despite the activity of the day and the chaos and anything that has happened. And in those instances, the surroundings do seem to help me begin that focus on God. So I'm not sure that it's always that way. I don't think it needs to be that way. It's definitely not an instance, or it's definitely not an advocation of a belief that we always have to worship in a certain place. But I think sometimes carefully chosen surroundings can definitely enhance our times of worship. So those are my thoughts on Day 98.